Okay, everyone, we're just going to give it almost a minute or so to let people file into the room.
On thinking and learning and memory, very important parts of what the field does, what our department does. Social psychology, that's what I do. That's my background. I'm a social scientist. I study the ways in which we can apply a scientific method to understanding day-to-day interactions and communication and group problem solving and decision making and so forth. My particular focus in my research in large part examines questions related to racial equity, racism, intergroup relations, and so forth. This is a representative parsing of the field of psychology. And one of the reasons why I like this topic of psychology and law so much is that when I teach the class on this topic, we get to look at all of these different approaches. So we talk about in my psychology and law course, criminal behavior and treatment as a portion of what our focus is throughout the course of the semester. And so we consider some issues related to psychopathology. We talk about psychophysiology and neuroscience, in particular when we do our section on detecting deception, on lie detection. I've often brought to class a state trooper who's a polygrapher who does polygraph and brings the polygraph with him to class and hooks several of the students up and me sometimes up in front of the class and asks questions, and we see the ways in which the body does and doesn't give us information we might need in order to figure out if someone's being honest. Unfortunately, children often find themselves in our criminal justice system as witnesses or even victims to crimes and to other issues that are being adjudicated. And so the question of the ways in which and the degree to which children are able to be reliable witnesses is, again, unfortunately, an important one and a pertinent one to think about from a psychological standpoint. And moreover, adults more generally, memory and eyewitness memory is a major area of focus of the course that I teach. It's an area that a lot of psychologists have studied over the years. Again, learning and memory and understanding those processes as they play out in the legal system. And then, of course, a range of social psychological phenomena that happen in the legal system, how juries make decisions as groups and try to persuade one another, persuasion more generally in the courtroom. If we have anyone amongst us who's a litigator, I would argue that what you are is a social psychologist, just in practice here, in crafting a story and persuading a jury. Police interrogations, another very fraught social psychological experience. And so these are the kinds of topics we touch on in my psychology and law seminar. We are not going to be able to hit on all of these. That's a semester-long course. We're going to pick one or two of them as time permits. And we'll talk through what psychology has to offer the legal system, what we can learn about the legal system from a psychological standpoint, and for that matter, what the legal system helps us understand a little bit better as psychological scientists. So let's get into the first topic that we are going to discuss. We're on Zoom here. I got to make sure I'm clicking the right buttons to show you the right things here. So we'll move to our next slide. No, not that. This. Okay. Here's where we want to be: detecting deception. So I mentioned this. I alluded to this. I suggested we'd be talking about in my course the ways in which we can use the body and other cues to detect deception. Well, we're going to try a little exercise ourselves. We're going to see how good all of you are at detecting deception from individuals. Specifically, here's what I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you a series of video clips of Tufts students describing an embarrassing childhood memory. Now, these were clips that were filmed a couple of years ago, so these are actually all Tufts alumni as well. You're going to see, however, a clip of them when they were a student on this campus, and their job, their instruction was describe an embarrassing childhood memory. But before they did this, out of a hat or a mug, I forget what it was at the time, I pulled out one of two slips. It either said T for truth or F for false. At random, some of these individuals that you are going to see were assigned to be truthful, and at random, some of them were assigned to be deceptive. And so their job, regardless, is to convince you, the viewer, that they're telling the truth, but some of them really are and some of them are not. So what I ask you to do now, and I'm asking, this is a thought exercise more so than something you'll be asked to submit, though we will do some polling questions at various points during this seminar today. I'm going to ask you to think about the following question. If you are going to watch, and you are, I'm telling you this, a bunch of video clips of strangers, and you are going to try to figure out whether these strangers are being truthful or being deceptive, my question for you is, what are the cues you are going to look for in trying to detect deception? I'd like you to actually take 5-10 seconds and think about, even jot down, what will you be paying attention to as you watch video clips of college students and try to figure out whether they're being honest with you or whether they're being deceptive. Take a moment, maybe jot down 1 or 2 cues you're going to pay attention to in your newfound role here as detectors of deception. I'll give you a moment to think about that. Okay, so what I also need you to do is find a piece of paper or an open document on your computer and number it 1, 2, 3, 4. Because I'm going to show you 4 video clips. We're going to call them students 1, 2, 3, and 4, though the students are going to tell you their names and they are their real names. They're not lying about that. And so for each of these students, your job is going to be to watch the clip and then write down on a piece of paper, T or F, true or false. We'll come back after having watched all 4 of these and we'll do a little Zoom poll survey and see what everyone as a group thinks. But for each of these short clips that you watch, I want you to pay attention to the clip and I want you to jot down privately on your own. Don't put it in the chat. We don't want anyone else, or in the Q&A. We don't want other people to see this. We want your own private opinions. Jot down whether you think this person is being honest, telling the truth, or is being deceptive. Yeah, T or F, true or false. So here comes our first student. I'm going to play the video for you, and then we'll ask you to write down your response, and we'll move on to the next one. Here we go.
So, my name is Becca, and I'm a senior, and my embarrassing story is that when I was in gym class in elementary school, when we got to the basketball segment, the rule was that you always had to make a basket before you were allowed to go back to the end of the line, and I could never make the basket, so I was always the last kid there. It was so embarrassing. Eventually the gym teacher would have to get a chair, and I'd have to stand up on it and try to shoot the basket in.
All right, that was student 1. That was Becca. Just jot down on a piece of paper, T or F, true or false for Becca. We're now going to move on to student number 2. Same assignment for you. Here goes.
Hi, my name is Amira. I'm from Washington, D.C., and I'm a sophomore. And my embarrassing story is, when I was in 2nd grade, we had this activity where we all sit on the rug and we all sit in a circle. And when we do this, everyone likes to tell a story about what they did this weekend and things like that. And so I was really excited about this because this weekend I had gone to Disney World and I was so excited and I really wanted to tell my story, but I really had to use the bathroom. So I waited for my turn, and I was the last person to go. So I finally got to tell my story about how I went to Disney World and I met Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse, and it was awesome. But then all of a sudden my pants felt really warm. And so I tried to act like nothing happened, and everything was fine, and then someone was like, oh, I smell something weird, but I kind of acted like nothing happened. And then we went back to our desks, and the teacher was like, there's a big wet spot on the ground.
Okay, same job for you. T or F, true or false for Amira, student number 2. Now we move to student number 3.
Hi, I'm Lizzie. I'm a junior. My embarrassing story is when I was in elementary school and my mom used to dress me in skirts and tights, but I was more of a tomboy, and one day we were jumping in the playground on a little bridge that moves, and my skirt fell down in front of everyone, and it was pretty embarrassing.
Okay, that was number 3. That was Lindsay, true or false on your piece of paper. And we'll do one more. Here comes student number 4.
Hi, my name is Sophie. I'm a senior at Tufts studying psychology, and this is my embarrassing story. So one day in 3rd grade, I believe, I was on the playground having fun, all the girls, guys hanging out. We're on the little, I don't know what it's called, that spinning guy, and everyone would sit on and see how long you could spin until you yelled that you needed to stop because you were too dizzy. It was great, great fun, whatever. Flash forward, spelling test later that day, and I had eaten some colorful food earlier, and the stress of the test combined with the fun on the playground, I ended up throwing up all over my spelling test, and then I didn't know what to do, so I just sat there and cried until the teacher came and took care of me.
All right, so this is your final, your fourth of your four questions, true or false for student number 4, for Sophie. So if we were all together in class, we would talk through now what, and again, I asked you, what are you going to pay attention to? What cues are you going to look at? And now you've done this 4 times. Perhaps that's reinforced your strategies that you thought of ahead of time. Perhaps you've now come upon new ideas for what you might pay attention to. And we would talk that through, and that's an interesting conversation that we have in class. But another interesting conversation we have is how good are we at doing this? So let's find out how good we are at doing this. What I'm putting on the screen now is a picture, a still frame from student number 1. This was the first story you heard. We're going to push a poll to you now. This poll is going to ask you to record whether you think student number 1, Becca, is telling the truth, or whether you think that student number 1 was lying. And I'll ask you to vote now. And we'll give people a moment so we can record some votes from everyone in attendance here. And before I give you the actual answer as to whether Rebecca was telling you the truth or not, in fact, I'm going to let Becca do it, or at least college Becca do it. We're going to see how we as a group have done, at least what our answer is as a unit in the aggregate. So the votes are still coming in. I'll give you a moment to record your vote here. I think we've got a lot of votes. So Isa, if you want to push the poll or publish the poll, I think we're ready whenever you're ready to do that. So you see, it's a mixed bag. More of us do have Becca telling the truth than we have her lying, but it's not an open and shut case here, 59% to 41%. Let's get the actual reveal from Becca.
Becca, you told us a story about your less than stellar basketball pursuits. Was that true or is that false?
That was false.
That was false. So the majority of us are 0 for 1 so far on this task. 41% of us thought that Becca was lying, and that was correct. 59% of us thought she was telling the truth. Let's see how we do with our next.
Becca, you told
our next candidate here, student 2. We have another poll for you on student 2. Record your vote if you would. Do you think Amira was telling the truth, or do you think Amira was lying? You can see the votes coming in. It's very exciting. It's like being backstage during election night as I see this all happening. All right, I think, Isa, we're ready to publish this one. This one is super close. We're at 51-49. We are split right down the middle when it comes to Amira. So we're learning there's variability here. That's one thing we've certainly learned. Let's hear from Amira about her response.
Amira, you told us a story about the Disney World show and tell gone awry. Was that a true story or was that made up?
I made it all up.
She just made it all up. In that case, again, about half of us thought she was lying, but the other half of us, slightly more, thought she was telling the truth. Let's pull up student number 3. We'll run another poll here. So vote for student number 3. Lindsay, do you think she was telling the truth or lying? All right, Isa, I think we're ready for that one too. But we are split right down the middle again. These are all coming in right down the middle, 52 to 48. I think Lindsay was telling the truth. Let's hear from Lindsay. Oh no, we don't want to do that. There we go.
Lindsay, you told us a story about your skirt. Was that true or was that false?
Yes, it was true.
That one was true. If you had true for that one, 52% of us did. You got that one right. We're going to do one more. Sophie, student 4, here's your poll. All right, I think we're ready to publish these results too. I don't think I've ever seen these come through. They're all at like 50-50. Again, we're 51-49. Sophie telling the truth here. Let's find out from her.
Sophie, you told us a story about colorfully vomiting all over your spelling test in 3rd grade. Was that true or false?
That was false. I completely made that up.
All right, so 49% of us got that right, 51% of us got that one wrong. Thank you for your cooperation and for playing along there. What have we learned about detecting deception? Well, I think what we've learned about detecting deception here is that it's really, really hard. Like were we good at this? It felt like we were sort of a coin flip at this. We were at 51-49 for 3 of the 4. And I think the first one we were at something like close to a 59-41% split. We were right down the middle. there may be some people out there who went 4 for 4, 3 for 4, even 4 for 4. My guess is we have some 1 for 4s and even some 0 for 4s out there. This is a really hard thing to do, is one thing that you learn when you start to look into the scientific research on this question. And people have done scientific research on this question. In fact, here's a study from 1991. Ekman and O'Sullivan did a study in which participants were shown 10 one-minute clips of college-age women describing their emotional reaction to a film that they had watched. It turns out that in this study, some of the women on this film, on video, were being truthful, and some were being deceptive. Ekman and O'Sullivan were interested in asking the question, are participants able to detect deception? Basically what we just did. We just did that study. It wasn't about reactions to a film. I asked people to talk about an embarrassing thing from their childhood, but you saw college-aged women describing something somewhat emotional from the past, some of them being truthful, some of them being deceptive, and the question Ekman and O'Sullivan were interested in, are participants able to detect deception? So you just got to be participants in that study, more or less. We can now talk about what Ekman and O'Sullivan did. And the further wrinkle to their study was they were not only interested in the question of how good are people doing this, but also the question of, are different types of people with different backgrounds better or worse at doing this? And when I say different types of people or backgrounds, here's what I mean. The participants in the Ekman and O'Sullivan study were these 6 different groups. They had a group of college students judging their fellow college students. And then they picked a series of professional backgrounds, all of which have at least one foot in the world of thinking that part of the daily job might involve detecting deception. Federal polygraphers, people who actually do polygraph testing, judges, police, psychiatrists, and US Secret Service agents. So take a minute, think about if you had to put money on one of these 6 as who's going to be the top performers in this study, who might you pick? And in fact, we've got another poll for you. So we'll show you a poll with these 6 as your answer choice options. We'd like you to predict, if you can, and we're ready for that poll whenever you're ready. Here it comes. Who do you think is going to be best at this task? So take a moment, look at those 6 groups, and register your bet for who you think is going to be best at this task. Now, when we do this in class, and I don't want to sway people unduly here, so take what I say with a degree of salt. I want your answer and not one that's influenced by social influence or social pressure. But I often go around the room and ask people to generate explanations for the different predictions they might make. And you'll hear people say, well, polygraphers, that's what they do. They do lie detection. They should be good at this. Judges should be good at this because they have people in front of them all the time who are testifying or pleading, and they can discern whether they're telling the truth or not, or they get the end result and they see, and so forth. People will make arguments on both sides of the case. They'll say, well, psychiatrists should have a good sense of whether people are telling them the truth or not. And others will say, well, aren't psychiatrists basically supposed to take the subjective reality of their patients at face value and not so much worry who's telling the truth or lying, and rather help them work through whatever their reality seems to be. And we'll have people who will say college students should be best at this because it's an in-group, it's their own people who eventually are going to be judged in this task. Maybe college students spend a lot of their time amidst college students figuring out who's telling them the truth and who's not. Perhaps they'll be best at this task. I think we can end the poll maybe and publish the results so that everyone can see what the group at large thinks about these. So you can see here are our results. We're a little bit all over the map, though you'd expect that. It looks like psychiatrists were the #1 choice, with college students a close second. And then we've got polygraphers and Secret Service, with judges and the police beyond that. Okay, so let's get rid of the poll and let's look at the actual data. Let's see what actually happened in this study with Ekman and O'Sullivan. So I'm going to show you the order in which these individuals actually performed. Starting with the best performers in this study were actually US Secret Service agents, followed by psychiatrists, judges, police, polygraphers, and college students. Now, before you get too excited about having gotten this right or too dejected about having gotten this not even close to right, let me show you the important caveat, which is that most people, regardless of the order of this list, weren't that great at this task. The college students were 52.8% accurate. This is a 50-50 proposition, right? The college students are really not much better than a coin flip. And this is not a statistically significant difference. 52.8% in this study was not statistically different than chance, than 50%. But for that matter, neither were the polygraphers or the police, who weigh in at 55, 56%. Those are not numbers that are statistically different than chance here. They're not performing at that higher rate either. And you know what? Neither are the judges or the psychiatrists. The only group whose performance was statistically meaningfully different than 50% than chance in the study were the U.S. Secret Service agents, and even they weigh in at a 64.1. I guess that's a D on the letter grade scale that gets used in class, right? So no one is doing all that well on this task. It's a hard task. Now, is it as hard a task as we're making it out to be, as Ekman and O'Sullivan made it out to be? I think if we have in our midst, and we may, Secret Service agents with us today, or psychiatrists, or judges, or police, my guess is that we get pushback. My guess is that a police officer might say, all right, really interesting, professor, but let me tell you something. When I am interviewing a suspect, I don't watch a 30-second video clip and make my decision from that. I've been trained. I get to ask questions, right? I get to follow up. I get to try to catch them in inaccuracies. I get to do things, and they do this during police investigations, interrogations, interviews. All right, tell me the story again. Okay, tell me the story again. Tell me the story again, but work backwards. I want you to start at the end and go back to the beginning. Those are hard things to do, and to do reliably and consistently when you're making something up. I mean, they're hard things to do when you're telling the truth, to be honest. But I think that members of these different professions would probably say that we're underestimating their performance. I know they would, because the polygrapher I have come to class, students ask, how accurate are you in determining whether someone's lying or not? And his response is always, 98, 99%. I know before I even start the test. As a scientist, I'd like to see those data. But I think there's a reasonable case to be made that what happens in real life is different than what we did in the study, right? The study is a fixed and two-dimensional video that you don't get to interact with. But I think the basic premise holds. This is hard, and it's hard for a number of reasons. When we do this in a class, we often talk through with the class, well, what were the cues you were looking for in detecting deception? And people talk about nonverbals, and they talk about the words people choose to use, the level of detail. They talk about eye contact, the character, the quality of voice. Does someone seem confident, or do they stutter and have speech disfluencies? And those are all reasonable things to think about. But what's interesting about them is that people have hypotheses on both sides of the equation. Students will say things like, well, I think someone who's making a lot of good eye contact is telling the truth and doesn't look evasive, so I think that that's honest. And someone else will say, well, I think someone who's making good eye contact is nervous about looking around the room and therefore is probably lying. And we'll get arguments on both sides of the equation. It's also worth noting that a lot of what people are citing here as cues they will look to are really cues that indicate arousal. And cues of arousal or anxiety, we're assuming, as the polygraph test does, that the anxiety derives from wanting to conceal the fact that you're lying, right? That trying to hide this falsehood or the knowledge that you're lying is what makes us aroused and anxious. But think about what we asked people to do in this study. I asked them, or in our demonstration, I asked them to share an embarrassing story from their childhood that will be shown to other people. They might be at a baseline somewhat anxious, nervous about doing that. Much as well, not in the same light, the same magnitude, but much as someone who's being interviewed by police might be anxious or nervous, even if they're telling the truth. We can detect anxiety and arousal to some degree, but do we know where that anxiety or arousal comes from? The other really interesting aspect of the Ekman and O'Sullivan study is that in real life scenarios, we never really know what the ground truth is. Is this person being honest or not? I mean, in my example, yes, because I assigned these college students to be honest or to not, and they told us afterwards. In a real investigation, we don't know. I mean, yes, the polygrapher I bring to class will say, well, a lot of these cases end in conviction. We got the right guy. Conviction certainly doesn't mean that someone is necessarily lying to us or necessarily guilty. It's hard to know what the reality is, but Ekman and O'Sullivan knew what the reality was because, again, they had assigned participants to be truthful or to be deceptive. And what they're able to do then is examine a variety of what they refer to as channels of communication. And Ekman and O'Sullivan broke down those channels of communication to their categorization scheme of 4 different ideas. Words, the actual words, the content of what you choose to say. Face, how your facial expression looks, eye contact, and so forth. Body posture, a closed body posture, people fidgeting. And voice, not what you say, but how you say it. speech disfluencies, voice cracking, and so forth. And what Ekman and O'Sullivan find is that the best indicators of deception vary depending on which channels we're talking about. They found, for example, that words and face are relatively controllable channels. So the words that you choose to use, or what you do with your face, eye contact and other facial expression, those were things that people in the study seemed to be able to control and not betray whether they were lying. And again, think about what you would do if I asked you to tell a lie to someone. You might think carefully about what words to use. Maybe you'd think about where you looked in your eye contact. But what Ekman and O'Sullivan suggest is that body and voice are less controllable. They're relatively uncontrollable. That it's harder to, your body, there's a lot going on, and it's harder to restrain yourself from fidgeting or taking the cap off a pen and putting it on over and over and over again, or closing your body posture off, or pacing or moving, rocking back and forth. Those things are harder to control. Voice is harder to control, right? If we could control our voice cracking and speech disfluencies, middle school and puberty would have been very different experiences for a lot of us. And just in general, that's a harder thing to control. And we learned that from this research. So I think what we learned from the science of detecting deception is that it's hard, it's a challenging thing to do, and that there are some conclusions we can draw about what people can and can't control in that context. All right, we have time for one more topic. I want us to switch gears here. We're going to switch colors on our slides to indicate that we're switching to a new topic. Let's talk a little bit about eyewitness memory. It's another incredibly important topic to think about from a psychological standpoint, but for the real world as well. There are few types of evidence that are as persuasive to a jury as an eyewitness identification. An eyewitness being there on the stand and saying, absolutely, Your Honor, the jury, I remember who it was that day. I'll never forget that face. It's that guy sitting right there at that table in the suit. I'm 100% sure. That is incredibly persuasive to hear in a courtroom. In fact, some studies suggest that that's even more persuasive to the average juror than some forensic analysis might be, or than other forms of evidence, that eyewitness, a confident eyewitness, super, super persuasive to a jury. But you knew there was a but coming. Some of you are familiar perhaps with the Innocence Project or other more regional versions of the Innocence Project, in which legal professionals, lawyers, and others, investigators, have looked into crimes, cases from years, decades earlier. And at the national level, at the Innocence Project nationwide, over 350 people have been exonerated, usually through DNA exoneration. In other words, samples left at the scene of the crime 12 years ago when a certain analysis wasn't possible, but now we're able to go back and do an analysis, and lo and behold, it excludes the person who was convicted from the crime of possibly being the person who perpetrated the crime. Over 350 people have been exonerated from DNA means and others nationwide in the Innocence Project, even more than that when you look at all the regional offshoots of the Innocence Project. And in more than 75% of those DNA exoneration cases, there had been at least one confident, but now we know incorrect eyewitness. At least one person who had said at the time of the crime, absolutely, that was the person, I'll never forget that face. Is it possible that some of those people were lying for various reasons, to protect themselves, to get a deal? Sure. But there are a lot of people in that sample, in those trials. There are a lot of episodes here that we now know about where witnesses doing a good faith, well-intentioned effort to pick out the person, perhaps a person they spent time with and even had substantial physical contact with, despite their best efforts, people getting it wrong. Some cases, multiple eyewitnesses confidently getting it wrong. How could that possibly be is something that is a vexing question for the system, and certainly one that is intriguing to psychologists, and a lot of psychologists have studied these issues. So it's an opportunity for us to do another little demonstration. We could have arranged for someone to break into my office here and run into the scene and steal my, I just knocked my laptop, steal my phone and run out, or my laptop and run out. That wouldn't have been a good idea for a number of reasons. I need the laptop to finish the presentation. Also, don't need people calling the police and suggesting that. So I will say, if someone does break into the office and takes my laptop, someone help me. It's not staged. That would be real. We're not doing that. Instead, we're going to do a safe version of this. I'm going to show you an image. This is an image from an actual security camera that captures someone accused of committing an armed robbery. So I'm going to show you this photograph, and I'm going to ask you to make an identification afterwards. So let's think about the ways in which the task I'm giving you is different than a real eyewitness's task, right? On the one hand, I admit that there's some challenges here. It's a grainy, low-res image. It's not going to be an easy image to see. It's going to be an image that you're only going to see for 2 seconds. I'm not going to show it to you for a long period of time. So I recognize that this grainy, low-res image from a security camera that you're seeing now transported through the world, through the ether over Zoom for only 2 seconds, it's not a great opportunity to see this individual. On the other side, I'm warning you now that you're going to have to ID this person. Eyewitnesses in real crimes don't get that luxury, don't get that privilege, right? They're surprised, or maybe they're asked about someone they saw 3 weeks earlier in line renting a car. Moreover, you are not scared for your safety during this. You understand how images work and that this person cannot do anything to jump out of the screen and do anything to you. So you've got certain advantages here. You're relaxed and you know that it's coming. So it cuts both ways. I'm going to show you this photo. I'm going to show it to you for 2 seconds. And then when the photo goes away, I'm going to read you some instructions and I'm going to give you a photo array and I'm going to ask you to make an identification. So here goes. Again, I'd ask you not to share any information in the chat publicly because we don't want other folks unduly influenced by your own memory or your own perception. So here we go. Here's your image, 2 seconds. All right. Having seen the gunman, you should now be able to pick him out from a photo spread. In examining the photo spread, keep in mind the gunman's appearance might have changed somewhat. Take your time and examine every person carefully. Here's your photo array. There are 5 photos to choose from. I'm going to give you a minute. I want you to look at each one. I don't want you to just jump at one. I want you to look at each one. We're going to put a poll up so we can run the poll now. We're not going to publish the poll yet because we're going to give you a full minute. When you're ready to make your identification of which of these photos is the man from the security camera earlier, go ahead and indicate it. I'm going to be quiet for 30 seconds and let you look. I'm going to give you about 10 seconds left. Look at all 5 photos before you make your indication here. All right. Time to lock in your vote if you haven't done so yet. Anissa, I think we're ready to go ahead and publish these results and share them with everyone. So here you see we've got a spread. This is not an easy task. We knew it wasn't going to be an easy task. It looks like number 2 is the winner or the loser, as it were. But we've got at least double digits in percentages here and in votes for all 5 of these individuals. I'm going to show you the right answer in a minute. Remember what it is that you wrote, but we can take the poll down for now. Let's talk about research on eyewitness memory. Research on eyewitness memory has identified 2 broad categories of cues, of factors, of variables that influence an eyewitness's performance. The first set, my guess is these are ones you've thought of before. These are estimator variables, as psychologists refer to them. Estimator variables are factors that influence someone in the actual scene itself, their ability to be an eyewitness, the lighting at the scene, how long a look they got, the distance between them and the perpetrator, whether they were in a stressful scenario and there's a weapon present or not. And the factors that, again, influence basically how good a view you're able to get and your emotional state at the time of the incident. I think to the degree that people think about eyewitness memory and perhaps its strengths and limitations, this is probably the category that they think of most. These are the factors that come to mind, and they are important. But what we give less thought to, and what psychologists have sort of brought to the forefront of the attention of the public and of the legal profession more generally, would be system variables. Aspects under control of the system. Aspects like, are we doing this as an in-person lineup or as a photo array? What instructions am I giving you? How do I select the other people, the other photos in that photo array? How long after the event do I do the photo array? Do I interview the witnesses separately or have them do the photo array identification together? And so on and so forth. These, I don't think, are issues we think about as much. And until recently, they really weren't issues that police departments thought about all that often either. It's been a real success story in many regards that in the last couple of decades, psychological scientists, researchers, and practitioners in the actual system have had more communications with one another And there have been ways in which some system aspects have changed as a result of research that's been conducted on these questions. So let me show you a particular study. We're going to talk about a particular study here. It's a study that was conducted by Gary Wells and Amy Bradfield in 1998. They used the same materials that I just showed you, that security camera footage, the 5 photos in the photo array. And now is the time where I get to tell you the answer to that photo lineup that I showed you. As you recall, number 2 got the leading number of votes, but all parties involved got votes. And perhaps some of you suspected at the time or now have come to suspect that the reality is none of those were the guy from the security camera footage. The guy was not present in the photo array. Now that's cheating, you're probably saying. Maybe you're agitated. That's fair. Part of being a psychology professor is agitating people. And in this case, there was a reason for the agitation. And you might say, well, again, it wasn't fair. You didn't tell us that none of the above was an option. And that's right, I didn't. I was very careful not to. I said you should be able to pick the guy out now, and I didn't have a poll option for none of the above. And I would argue that often in real life, that's the case as well, and we'll get to that in a moment. But the other reason I did it is because that's what Wells and Bradfield did. They showed this photo lineup to people, and everyone who made an identification in the study was wrong. So everyone is getting this wrong. And then what they vary in their study is the feedback you get as a participant. So what they varied was that half the participants, after they made their ID, were told actually it was number 3. Well, or if you said it was number 3, actually it was number 4. So you're led to believe you got it wrong. Or you're told, good, you identified the suspect. And again, keep in mind, everyone's wrong. So it's not like some of these people were really right and some were wrong. They're all wrong. But they're either led to believe that they were wrong or led to believe that they were right. And the reason Wells and Bradfield did this is they wanted to know the effect that this kind of feedback might have on witnesses' ratings of confidence in their identification. Those participants who were led to believe by feedback that they got this wrong, 15% report having been very confident at the time they made the identification. Those individuals who were told, good, you identify the suspect, 50% identify themselves as very confident in the time of their identification. This matters a lot, because if you think about what you do as a juror during a trial is you're paying attention to the confidence of a witness who takes the stand. And being told or being led to believe that you got it right makes people more confident. Now, sure, in our case, in this case, it was very explicit. Good, you identified the suspect. Perhaps in real cases, it's not always that blatant, though sometimes it is, having read some transcripts of these procedures in the past. But just think about the experience of coming down to the station, making identification, then a month or two later being asked to come to a pretrial hearing where you see the same individual seated at the defense table and you are asked to testify in the case, and then again testify during the actual trial. You sort of get the message that the police think you got this right and the prosecution thinks you got this right. Does that inflate people's confidence? Do they go from being marginally confident to pretty confident by the time you get to trial? There might be reason to believe that, yes, that is indeed the case. What we learn more generally from research on eyewitness memory is that an eyewitness completes a photo identification or other eyewitness identification task through processes of relative judgment. That is, what you do as an eyewitness is you pick someone from that lineup or photo array who best resembles what you remember relative to all the other options provided to you. In other words, an eyewitness in an identification procedure follows the same strategy that a student taking a multiple choice exam does. Process of elimination, which is the best option compared to the other options. So that means the instructions you're given make a difference. The other response options provided to you make a difference. Little things that perhaps we don't think about make a big difference when it comes to the system. And so this also opens the door to think about what some remedies are for false identifications. And perhaps some of those now you have in mind, having sat through and thought about these issues as we've just talked about them, right? If I wanted to make sure that the feedback effect doesn't happen, that the person administering the lineup doesn't give feedback intentionally or otherwise to the witness that changes their confidence, well, then I could have a blind administrator, some other investigator do the lineup who doesn't know if there is a suspect or who that suspect might be. This is a no-brainer as a researcher, right? If you heard about a clinical drug trial or a new vaccine for COVID or an herbal pill that's supposed to influence your memory, you'd want to see a double-blind trial. You would want to know that the researcher didn't know what condition you were in. Were you in the placebo condition or the treatment condition? Because it's the only way to make sure you don't get researcher bias. And if researchers are biased intentionally and unintentionally, well, police officers can be as well. And so blind administrators, one important recommendation that's come out of this research. Other remedies you might think of, given that you know now what you do about relative judgments, would be the instruction to tell participants that the witness may or may not be in the lineup. They don't have to pick someone. And indeed, if you ever have the misfortune of having to be an eyewitness in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and some other states, you'll probably be told that the witness may or may not appear and that the police will continue to investigate regardless of whether you pick someone. That said, I think there's still an implicit message. If we're coming to see you or bringing you to the station to show you some photos, probably we think there's someone in there. The police don't make a habit out of bringing you down, showing you 10 photos. You say, no, it's none of them. And they say, woohoo, you passed the test. We'll call you if we find anything. So I think the assumption may still be there, may still be problematic. Another remedy you might think of, and this is not the only other one, but the last one I'll give you is that you saw a simultaneous photo array, all 5 photos at once. That's pretty susceptible to relative judgment, a process of elimination. There are some states now that do sequential lineups. So you are shown photo 1. Is it this person? Yes or no? Is it this person? Yes or no? Is it this person? Yes or no? The advantage there is that relative judgments are harder to do. The disadvantage is that you might also be making it less likely that even correct identifications are made. And so there is this trade-off between making crimes investigatable, making them prosecutable, but also making sure we're getting the right parties. And that's a balance that is a tough one to walk, and a tough needle to thread sometimes. So we're nearing the end of my time, or at least my presentation time here. We're going to have some time for Q&A. I thank you so much for your attention and for being here. I do apologize for tricking you on the old eyewitness test and not giving you an option. So I'll make it up to you. We've got one last task. Earlier on, at the beginning of this presentation, maybe you were futzing with the monitor so you didn't notice. Maybe your attention was elsewhere. I sort of pretended that by accident I showed you a photograph for a second or two. Wasn't up there for very long, and I just went right by it and never talked about it again. Well, there was a purpose. There was a method to that madness too. I've got a photo lineup for you now to see if you can pick that person out. This time the person's in the photo lineup, I promise you. So here are your choices. There's 8 photos up. We have a poll for you. You don't have to register a guess if you didn't even notice that this was happening to begin with, but this is one you could actually get right. I did show a photo earlier, and you have an opportunity to pick that person out of these 8 because that person is actually here. I promise you that. And so here's an opportunity again, if you feel like I didn't give you a fair shot earlier, to see if you can get this one right. And I'll give you a moment to register your votes. All right, you got 5 seconds to lock in your vote before we give the summary poll data, and then I'll show you the correct answer. All right, why don't we go ahead and publish these results? So we do have a favorite here, number 3, but you do see our votes are scattered all over the place. This is a hard thing to do. It was indeed number 3. Number 3, that was the photo on the left I showed you earlier, and then I showed you a different photo here on the right. So I just want to thank you again for your participation, your willingness to play the polling games here and engage with this, for being here to hear a little bit about this work. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so we can do some Q&A at this point.
Great. Thanks, Sam. That was fun. That was wonderful and fun. I just want to remind people you can ask questions using the Q&A feature. However, we have record-breaking attendance at this webinar. I'm happy to report. So we probably won't get through all, and we're going to try to consolidate like repetitive questions so we can address as many as we possibly can. So there was one question early on in the presentation about the students lying, and if it would make a difference, or have you looked at. So the person was saying that it was hard to detect because the incident took place a long time ago. So maybe they wouldn't be so emotionally charged. So to your point about the anxiety about it, how would it have changed if they had been presenting an incident that had happened more recently?
It's an excellent question. I don't know the answer to it. It's a reasonable hypothesis. These were events from a while ago. I mean, there are times where in real life people are being interviewed about events from a long time ago as well. It is true that a more recent event might be one that is more emotionally and physiologically resonating. It's also the case that this was pretty low stakes. If these students couldn't convince you, the audience, that they were telling the truth, there's no repercussion to them. They're not going to prison. They're not going to be a suspect in an investigation. They're not in trouble for something that happened in terms of academic integrity and so forth. So it is a challenge to study some of these issues with the stakes that people experience in the real world. I think, yeah, thinking through those kinds of questions is a very reasoned sort of thing to ask about.
Intriguing question about poker players. If there's been any work done on, are they better at detecting deception? Are they better deceivers?
That is a great question. I'm sure there is that work, and I will be honest again, I don't know of it firsthand. I think that the idea that Secret Service agents, who, if you do think about the different tasks they have, Secret Service agents do at times need to suss out threat and deception and suspicion just by looking at someone from afar or from a close distance. And you could make a good argument that poker players have to do something similar, that what poker players do is probably more similar to what this task was than what police do. Police get to ask questions. Poker players, I guess you can talk throughout the hand, but for the most part, you're sitting there looking for tells. It would not surprise me if poker players were pretty good at this, or at least better than your average person.
There's also another interesting question about police sketches versus photo ID, which I think almost intersects the eyewitness and like the physical description topics when you think about it.
Yeah. Police sketches are an interesting phenomenon. There are now also versions of this where you can sit at a computer and basically, like when you design an avatar for a website and you get to pick broader nose, smaller nose, and sort of move things around. And there's some programs that have sort of a face composition that you can do. The jury's still out on that in some regards as to how effective and efficient that would be. For example, if I had really good police, or forget about police, if I had really good sketches of the five guys that you saw earlier, I think it just makes the task harder. I'm not sure it would have eliminated the concerns that we saw at an identification task, but that's not how it's used. It's usually used as, I'm a witness, I describe what I saw, you draw up that face. There are people who've studied those issues, and I think it varies a lot by sketch artist, and interesting sort of old school technology that can sometimes get used in some scenarios. It's susceptible to all the same kinds of biases and limitations as other eyewitness memory would be, like we're talking about here.
When you were talking about the polygraphers being good or not good at deceiving, you were talking about them. Were you talking about the test itself? How's the test?
Well, that's the thing. It's sort of both of them. Like, so this guy walks into my class. First of all, everyone thinks it's going to be like Meet the Parents, like a giant thing with pens that write and scribble. It's not. It's like a PowerPoint projector. It's like an LCD projector, and they hook it up to your computer. He sort of views it as like it's part of him. They go hand in hand. You can't have a test without the administrator, or the administrator without the test. Now, he does claim that he before the test even starts to go, he can tell whether people are telling you the truth or lying. The polygraph's really interesting because, first of all, if you look into the history of polygraph, there's some interesting intersections with Tufts University, actually, but I'll leave that to your own sleuthing. And the polygraph is really, it's a measure of physiological threat, is what it measures. So it measures your skin response, your electrodermal conductance. It measures your respiration rate. It measures your blood pressure, your pulse. It's measuring threat. And so it's actually, your answers to the questions don't matter, is what the polygrapher will tell our class. It's true. They come up with the questions. They tell you the questions ahead of time. They ask them several times. They'll say, so, were you on whatever Elm Street at 7 o'clock the night of that fire? And you're going to say no. Everyone's going to say no. In fact, if you say yes, the interview's over. You don't need the polygraph. You just admitted that you did it. This question is, how threatening does your body find the questions to be? And the challenge there also is, boy, being hooked up to a polygraph is a nerve-wracking experience. Now, they ask some control questions, and the question is, does your response to a certain type of question about the crime vary significantly from the control questions? So there's a lot of interesting research on the different types of questions that can be used. Are they asking you questions about concealed information that only the person who committed the crime could possibly know? That portion of the test seems to be a little bit more effective than the ones that just ask, are you the one who did this, and so forth. Threatening questions, period. So it's sort of a team effort. He views the polygraph as an extension of him.
Yeah, it's like, and the quality of the question too, I think,
Yeah, they're very different. Think about being asked, were you involved in an arson on Elm Street at 7 o'clock on July 6th? I'd be threatened by that question, even though I've never started a fire in my life. That's a threatening question. And that's certainly be more threatening than questions that ask, are you Sam Sommers? Did you graduate from college in this year? Did you? So now they try to come up with some better control questions. So maybe ask you some control questions about stealing things from work. Have you ever done that? Have you ever, how often do you consume pornography? Things that are going to get be a threatening question to you that are a little bit better. And the comparisons, controls. So now, am I even more threatened by the crime related questions than those? Again, the one that seems to work best is if I have enough information to be able to say, so, Marianne, there was an assault that was committed. And we think it might be you. I'm going to name several different weapons, and I'd like you to tell me if you used it in committing the assault. And then, did you use a rock? Did you use a revolver? We can play the whole game of Clue. Did you use a candlestick or a lead pipe? And that if you're the person who committed it, could be the only one who knows it was a lead pipe. And if you react to that, that's pretty good evidence. But there's rarely, that requires you to have some sort of concealed information the public doesn't know. It doesn't always work. And so the structure of the test becomes really important.
Interesting. There's one question here that I'm hoping you can answer, but then maybe segue into some of the cases you've actually been expert witnesses on, because I think that would be really interesting. And the question is, based on newer research, can a good defense attorney impugn most eyewitness testimony? So that kind of gets to like, what is our, how do we deal with these problems that we have as human beings with our memory and our eyewitness account and stuff?
I have testified as an expert witness in many cases, often about eyewitness issues. And as an expert witness, I can't ever tell you this person's telling you the truth, this person's acting, this person's not my job. Anyone who says they can do that as an expert, you should run away from. But what I can do is point out for the jury some of the things to look for, concerns. If you have a case in which really the only evidence that links this defendant to the crime is an eyewitness identification and nothing else seems to match up. And if we're talking about a scenario where it's a high stress experience for the witness, they didn't get to see the person for very long. There've been trials I've consulted in where you've got someone was shown like 300 photos out of a photo mug book. They picked no one. And then a week later, they're shown a lineup and some of the people who are from that mug book are now in the lineup. And so those are things that are cause for concern. I do think that if you have a trial as a defense attorney where the only evidence against your client is an eyewitness, it doesn't mean that the eyewitness is wrong, but it does mean that thinking about some of these questions is worth considering. I've had students say, and there are countries that put less stock in eyewitnesses, I've had students say, well, maybe we shouldn't allow eyewitness evidence at all. Of course, there are some crimes that are not prosecutable without eyewitness evidence. A lot of abuse and assault cases, it's the victim and that's the evidence. And so I'm not suggesting that either. I'm not suggesting that most eyewitnesses get it wrong. We're not as good at this as we think we are. And I do think there's a role for educating juries about that.
We're almost out of time, and you've been generous, but I think there are two things I kind of want to pull out because I think they're somewhat important. And I should mention too to the crowd that, Sam, like, we can share your email address if people has a burning question in our follow-up message. It might take us a week to get it out, but you're available because we knew we weren't going to get to all of them. How do you handle a situation where you are the victim and as such want and need to be believed, and the focus is not being able to identify the person, but to validate views on what happened when no one was recording with a camera? So I guess how can you be a good eyewitness?
Well, I'll give you an example in a very low stakes environment. A couple of years ago, someone rear-ended my car. And I went home and I wrote it down. I didn't write it down. I pulled over and I took out my phone and I opened video voice memo and I just talked for a couple minutes about exactly what had just happened, because I knew, and there's some exceptions to this, like right after the event, if it's really scary, you could be in shock and maybe you don't have great memory. So this is something you could wait an hour or a day to, but I knew that I had a pretty good memory for what had happened. And I wanted to get it all on the record for myself in case I needed to do this later. I think writing something down or as soon as is reasonable for you to do so, making a record for yourself is useful. I'm not, again, a minor car accident is not the same as being assaulted. It's not the same as witnessing a crime. And so, that's not always something that one is able to do right away. I think being honest about the limitations of memory at some level too. I think that it's okay to realize that you're not going to have seen everything. You're not going to maybe remember what the other traffic in the other lane was like, or there are aspects of this you may not remember even the color of the car of the person who got out and then you witnessed assault someone else. That's possible. So what you can remember, you pay attention to, and you go with that. I think that it's we need to move forward as a society, recognizing that your memory is not a videotape, and that we don't always remember everything as it occurs, and that there are some experiences that are very stressful and very traumatic. We're not going to get great memory from that. But I think just trying to be consistent and recording what you can record when you can, the sooner you can, is often a good strategy to take.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and as we've learned about how we remember things and how we overwrite things and we fill in the blanks, and we've also learned, I think, about the susceptibility of suggestion to our memory as well, I think, especially in children. Okay, so there's a really, really loaded question that I don't think you can do quickly, but I think it's important.
Give it a shot.
And it has to do with eyewitness accounts and how race and gender can affect, or I'm sorry, maybe it was powers of deception or eyewitness accounts. I can't remember now because there were two questions I'm molding together. And I know it kind of falls into your area where you talk often about implicit bias. So if there's some high level ideas on that for folks.
Well, I see that there was one question that came through too about being the same race as for someone you're identifying, for example, and so forth. And that is something I've testified a fair amount about. It is true that we tend to do a better job of remembering faces when we categorize someone as being, quote, us versus them. And race and ethnicity are very salient along those lines. Research indicates that people tend to be better at remembering and accurately identifying faces of their own racial or ethnic group as opposed to of other groups. And that's not just white people judging faces or remembering faces of other groups. It's individuals from a variety of backgrounds. And what I often tell juries is there are two jobs that you want an eyewitness to do well. You want them to say, yes, that's the person when it's the person. And you want them to say, no, that's not the person when it's not the person. And on both of those tasks, we tend to do a better job when we code that person, see that person as a member of our own group. And there is something about groupness or categorization that seems to drive the effect. If you show people photos of individuals who could plausibly be a variety of different racial identities, who seem somewhat ambiguous, and you label, for example, there was a study done in Texas several years ago now, where there were some faces that were either labeled as being Latino faces or labeled as being Anglo-white faces. And that made a difference in terms of whether white and Latino participants did a good job remembering those faces. We seem to categorize and process faces differently when we see them as members of our own group as opposed to members of other groups. Another factor is experience and contact, that the more contact we have with a diverse group of people, like meaningful contact, not just I ride the subway and it's diverse, but the more meaningfully diverse our social universe is, the less susceptible we are to some of those other same race biases.
Great. It does make me think, I'd be remiss. Like, I saw the woman with the Wisconsin sweatshirt, and I'm from Wisconsin. So like, I was aware of the fact that automatically I'm like, oh, she must be telling the truth, right? She's from Wisconsin. We're all good people.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, so I think with this, we should wrap it up. And I want to just thank you once again for such an enlightening session. I also like to thank this time Amy and Issa, who sat in the background and managed the controls and helped with the chat and the polls. This was a group effort. I'd like to thank all of our attendees for joining us. And as I said, this is the last What Matters presentation for this season, but please watch for more this fall. I'd also be remiss not to mention that my colleagues here are hard at work planning for reunions. And if this is one of your years, please check out the schedule of events if you've not done so already. Amy's going to post the link to reunions in the chat now. And for now, like I said, just thank everyone. I want everyone to be well and hope to see you at a program in the future. Thanks again. Bye.